Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar of the Science Policy Forum for Biodiversity from the International Union of Biological Sciences. I'm Simon Häusler and I'm guiding you through a few technical details. We are going to use the Q&A function of Zoom today to collect all your questions for the talks to be given. Whenever you want to ask a question, quickly check, please, if your question or a very similar one is already being asked. If that's the case, you can just like it with the like button and we will prioritize these questions with a lot of likes then. If you have anything else to say to us, or if you have technical problems also, you can contact me via the chat. Also, feedback is always welcome in the chat box. And with this, I'm handing over to Karl-Josef.
Thank you. So also my warm welcome to all of you to our third webinar. So we had an exciting one on Monday on alien invasive species and yesterday on digital sequence information. And today we have this very important topic, how we can use the knowledge and the way of using nature of indigenous people and their role in conservation of biodiversity. Before we start with this very interesting topic, I would like to introduce you shortly to IUBS. So what you see is that it's quite a traditional and old union, and it was founded in order to be the voice of biology, the global voice of biology. It was established 105 years ago. And nowadays we have 110 national scientific and institutional members, for instance, national academies or international scientific associations, as you can see here. And to give you a short introduction into a few activities we have, I would like to activate the laser. Here it is. I show you a few priorities and main areas of work. So I show you one of the running programs where we provide seed funding. And so this deals with biodiversity and health big data. And that is very much related, for instance, to yesterday's topic of digital sequence information, naturally. We are now gathering today for the Science Policy Forum in context of the Convention of Biological Diversity, and I will come back to this on the next slide. We have a program running on pastoralism, which is a very significant contribution worldwide to the economies and the income of many, many people. And so we have to learn more about the social and ecological relationships. Not only in context of COVID, naturally zoonotic diseases are very important, and there is one program that is dealing with this topic, and very important as well, sorry, I repeat important, but it's true, we need a unified language in biology, we need a unified taxonomy, and since its establishment in 1919, IUBS was always involved in clarifying and setting standards for unified language. And then we were involved in the International Year of Basic Science for Sustainable Development, which is now shifted to the International Decade of Sciences for Sustainable Development that just started, and we are very much engaged in a lot of discussions nowadays how we should advance this decade for the sake of mankind and science. We are involved in educational activities, and so I would like to mention the climate education program. So Shashidara was one of the key elements, how to say, organizers in this education Tropixu, initially in context of the ICSU, International Council of Scientific Unions, nowadays called International Science Council. I should speed up, take too much time. Another educational program which is I think timely is education in ecology and understanding of dependencies in the worldwide system of nature. And we are also engaged in equal opportunities and gender equality. And we cannot do that alone. So the last thing I would like to mention, it depends a lot on collaborations. And I mention here the UNESCO or the Convention of Biological Diversity. And today's activity is related to it. I mentioned the International Science Council. And exemplarily, I like to mention the International Union for Quaternary Sciences, because that is an activity right now where we try to set something up for early career scientists. So that is my introduction to IUBS. And now, why do we organize this webinar? In October this year in Cali, Colombia, there is going to be the Convention of Biological Diversity Conference of Party, COP16. And in this context, on 2 days, it lasts for 2 weeks, in fact, in total. On 2 days, there's going to be the 6th Science Policy Forum. And IUBS always was responsible and very much engaged in organizing these science fora. And though we had already mentioned, I need not to repeat it, the 2 webinars before, and today we are going to hear something about indigenous people in conservation of biodiversity. And that is a program. Before I hand over to Renee and Suneetha, I would like to introduce Renee Borges. So she is an evolutionary biologist and professor at the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. And she is interested in behavioral and sensory ecology. And she is working on Figs and Figs walls that you see already some network interactions that is analyzed by her. And so she is an outstanding ecologist. And so I'm very happy that Renee agreed to organize together with Suneetha today's session. And with this, I stop and give you the floor. Thank you, Renee.
Thank you very much, Carl Joseph, for that introduction. And I think with that, we will go on and get going with today's webinar. I'll just share my screen very briefly and introduce what we are going to do.
In the meantime, I just want to mention there's a live poll going on. So just tell us, please, where you're from and what's your professional occupation. Thanks.
Okay, so this webinar will be moderated by myself and Suneetha Subramanian, who is in the Biodiversity and Society program at the United Nations University Institute for Advanced Study of Sustainability, and she's based in Tokyo, Japan. We've got 3 marvelous speakers lined up, and they will go in the following order. We will have Siddhappa Shetty first, followed by Jennifer Tauli Corpus, and then we will have Sharad Lele talking as the last speaker. Each speaker will get about 20 minutes, and after that, we will take in your questions. Of course, if you have a very specific question for one of the speakers just after the speaker has completed, and you can put that into the chat box and then we can try and take it up. But otherwise, we will hold the discussion. We've prepared a few questions that we would like all the speakers to deliberate upon, and we will take all of that up during the discussion session. So I think without further ado, then I would like to, I think Suneetha will Probably my slides don't seem to be moving. I don't know why. Simon, my slides don't move.
Should I end them for you? Or
Maybe I'll escape. I can't escape also. I'll stop sharing. Let's see.
But I could go ahead and introduce Dr.
Yeah. Please go ahead, Suneetha. You introduce. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Renee. And again, a warm welcome to all of you who joined us. And indeed, I'm very, very happy to invite Dr. Siddhappa Shetty, who is a senior fellow and the head of the center, the convener of the Center for Environment and Development at the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment in Bangalore, India. He's an ethnobotanist by training, but over 30 years has been very, very actively involved in encouraging sustainable use of forest resources and livelihood enhancement of tribals, especially in the Western Ghats region of India. So yes, the floor is yours now, Dr. Shetty, and we are eagerly looking to hear what you have to share from your experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Suneetha, for the nice introduction. Shall I share my screen?
Yes, please.
It's visible now.
Yes, your screen is visible.
Oh, thank you very much for everybody for the nice introduction, for inviting me for this webinar. I'm really grateful to IUBS for this opportunity. Having said that, I'll be talking about the Soliga tribal community. I've been working from past 30 years and their conservation practices and the Forest Right Act and then related work in this in my topic. As we discussed, I'll be basically talking about the Soliga community and their conservation practices and their association with the nature and flora and fauna. And later I will jump into Forest Right Act implementation and the livelihood project we have been implementing in this landscape. In fact, the Soliga community, distributed in Chamaranagar districts with 3 tiger reserves or wildlife sanctuaries. The one is Bilgi Rangaswamy Temple Tiger Reserve, that is shortly called as BRT, and Malaya Madheshwara Wildlife Sanctuary, where Veerappan used to live, and the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary, where link to the Kaveri River. And these are the 3 protected areas we've been working with from past almost more than 25 years. And this landscape, very biodiversity-rich hotspot and various types of vegetation and flora and fauna, things like that. The Soligas and BRT Tiger Reserve, in this community, we have around 35,000 people live in this landscape in Chamaranagar districts and with these reserve forests. And they used to do hunting and sifting cultivation before 1972, that's Wildlife Protection Act. And after that, they started doing settled agriculture. And then, before that, it was a reserve forest. In 1972, during the Wildlife Protection Act implementation, the area is declared as a wildlife sanctuaries. And now in 2011, it's declared as a tiger reserve. And there's various, the conservation kind of, engagement and the practices being kind of followed by the forest department in this landscape. And what we observed was in the traditional, the communities are what we observed was, they're rich in traditional knowledge. They kind of, the worship stones and water, trees, forest and wild animals. And traditionally, the flora and fauna is being worshipped and knowledge has been passed from one generation to other generation. For example, that with the sacred site, what you're seeing is the Dodasambige forest is around tree, the Michaelia Champaka trees, 2,000 years old, is being worshipped by the Soliga community. And then, the request came from them to map the sacred sites being worshipped by them in BRT a landscape. And, 3-4 years back, we are able to map all the sacred sites being worshipped by this community in this landscape. In the 540 square kilometer of the forest, we found 480 sacred sites. In each and every square kilometer of the forest, you would find their sacred sites. That's one of the things we have found. This is the map being generated, and it was also helpful to get their rights under the Forest Right Act. And also, we also did kind of, with a community participation, we are trying to classify the forest types, various forest types in this landscapes. They are able to, historically, based on the scientific data, we have 4 different forest types, 4 to 5 different forest types, starting from scrub, deciduous, evergreen, and shola, and grassland. And the community were able to, classify 22 different types of the forest. So that's the kind of, the depth of the knowledge they have in this landscape. That's what I would like to say. And then various festivals are associated with worshipping and celebrating nature and agriculture practices, and the harvest festivals and things like that. There are the very famous, popular, the songs being, the folk songs being, sung by the community, or completely all of them are associated with, nature, and then, the beauty of the nature, and its contribution to the life, and everything. And it reflects, the indigenous knowledge of flora and fauna and everything and also this is like, worshipping a tiger. We have been, the government has been putting a lot of effort to conserve the tiger, and then they actually worship tiger and various other animals. I'll come to that a little later. The worshipping trees is also like, I've been working on sustainable use of NTFPs for quite some time. One of the NTFPs being harvested by them is Terminalia bellarica, the fruits. And we don't need to go and talk to them about sustainable harvest practices and don't cut the branches when they harvest fruits and things like that. They basically protect each and every individual of the tree in the landscape. That's how, that's the harvest and also the practice being done by the community. And also Syzygium cumuli is also one of the trees being worshipped by the community in this landscape. And also the animals, including the tiger, elephant, they say the tiger god, elephant god, bison god, and bear god, and snakes also being worshipped, wild boars, and etc. In this landscape. And this is, the left side, what you see is the tiger, the temple, the tiger carving is being worshipped by the community in this landscape. And also the traditionally NTFP harvest practices I've seen before developing the manual I've written for the community on sustainable harvest techniques. What I observed was, when they're harvesting the roots and the tubers, and they make sure they leave, 25% to 30% of the tuber and the root and the soil for the germination and regeneration. And also this, before harvesting, they offer God, and then, try to harvest fruits and disperse them to the forest. And then there is a song sung by them to let the forest grow, and then regeneration improve, and things like that. This is what been observed. And also based on our past studies, we've been working in this landscape from past 20-25 years, and 75% of the income, 60 to 70% of the income was coming from harvesting non-timber yielding forest products like a gooseberry, soap nut, soapberry, honey, etc. So based on our previous studies also, it's clearly indicated that the tenure is very important for them. If they have tenure and the sustainable harvest, this practice is possible, and it helps to conserve the biodiversity. That's what we understood. Based on that, the forester, we have been able to work with the implement Forest Right Act in this landscape, and then able to build the capacity of the community and their institutions to implement this project on ground. And ATRI and the other institutions, local NGOs, played a facilitation role to get their rights in this landscapes. At the end of this exercise and everything, and it took quite a lot of time to implement this. The effort. What I'm talking about, the 77 Gram Sabhas have received community rights in this landscape. That amounts to 83 villages and 5,500 families and around 22,000 people got benefited out of community rights. The community rights refers to harvest rights, NTFP right, harvest rights to them, and also the individual rights under individual rights, and 2,000 people were able to get the rights in that. That's the cultivation rights. The Soligas cultivate the practice. They have. They basically small farmers. They have 1 to 1.5, 2 acre land. They are able to get the rights to cultivate their agriculture land. That's one of the things. And after that, we are now moving to the conservation rights under the Forest Right Act. We have Section 3(1)(I) use the facility, helps them to take the role of conservation. There's a conservation rights. Under that, we are facilitating to develop a community-led co-management plan in these landscapes. We have been able to do a significant number of workshops with the community participation. Around 1,000 people have participated in these workshops. We're able to, this is also one of the co-management workshops being conducted in BRT Tiger Reserve. And then basically what they come out was that they, under the Forest Right Act and the co-management, they would like to do the governance and the management. That's one of the issues need to be addressed, and the conservation and the livelihood. These are the three component they said they should be focusing on under the Forest Right Act. The governance and under the governance, they said the village and taluk and the district Forest Right Act monitoring and management community need to be constituted, and the committee should meet monthly once or 2 months once to discuss about protection of the forest and the livelihood of the communities. And thirdly, they said Forest Department and NGOs must participate in this meeting to give appropriate recommendations or consultations and something like that. There are a bunch of the recommendations they made under this governance program. I just picked up 3 important ones and sharing with you all. And the conservation related issues, they said the control of invasive species is going to be a very important issues need to be addressed, because based on our studies, I have a map. I'll show you that later, where we have around 60 to 70% of the forest is full of invasive species like lantana and camera. They said that those invasive species need to be controlled, and they encourage traditional litter fire. They say that the litter fire they used to practice traditionally before Wildlife Protection Act, that has been banned, and that leading to canopy fire. In order to protect the forest from canopy fire and huge forest fires, the litter fire would be the solution. And then to get rid of the invasive species, we need to start practicing litter fire. That is what they kind of recommended. And they also feel that coexistence is possible, and working with the Forest Department and community, the conservation is possible, and also living with the nature, harmony with the nature is possible. That's what they say. The community-based resource management should be encouraged by the Forest Department. That's what they felt. And the livelihood-related issues, they said the NTFP collection, right now there are outsiders coming and also the purchasing the NTFPs. They said that has to be done by the community themselves. The tender has to be participated by the community, the leaders and things like that would be helpful, that it has to happen within the community. Will get more benefit to their community. That's what they felt. And secondly, livelihood from complete eradication of the lantana. So we have some programs I would going to share with you all a little later, but they say that the livelihood opportunity from lantana is possible. We should be focusing on that as well. Government should take back land from coffee. There is a middle of the core part of the Tiger Reserve. There are 2,000 acres of coffee plantation given to the rich people are managing and using this. They're growing coffee and then using insecticide, pesticides, quite heavily polluting the river and things like that. They really felt that these coffee estates should be taken back from them and maybe given to the community for their livelihood enhancement, and then organically this land need to be cultivated. And provide fishing rights to the community is also one of the importance. They should do it. And the Forest Right Act, the Forest Department should encourage community in conservation, including tiger. The community should be encouraged to participate in conservation of the flora and fauna, including monitoring tiger. That's what they felt. And also currently the jungle lodges are using, doing a tourism in this landscape, and that need to be replaced by the community and the community institutions. That's what they felt, because that would generate income for them to monitor the flora and fauna. That's what they felt. Having said that, this is related to what I spoke about, that is rich, what kind of knowledge they have, what kind of flora and fauna they worship. And thirdly, the Forest Right Act implementation and the co-management plan. Under the co-management plan, what are the components? That's what I spoke. Under the Forest Right, after the Forest Right Act, we also did some enterprise-based conservation models earlier, before the tenure, and with the local NGOs. That was not really successful. And then we thought that it's a great opportunity to work with the community now, because they have a rights to harvest the resources. And also we had some bitter experience working with the local NGOs to implement the enterprise-based conservation models. Now this model should be should be engage with the community and their institutions, and they should feel that it belongs to them. In that sense, we have a 3 crore project funded by MSME, Ministry of Spurti project. Under that, we have odd interventions. We have a building, machineries, and everything is being built. And a part of it, we have a soft interventions. People are getting trained on sustainable harvest techniques and strengthening their knowledge. And then results of research work is being shared with them to build their capacity. At the same time, we also learn from them. The tools are being provided to them, and the processing unit were able to make around 50 lakhs turnover last year. They were able to get around 10 lakhs profit. The profit has already gone back to the community in the form of an incentive to conserve and monitor the resources. At least now, right now, they're facilitating to develop a co-management plan in this landscape. That is one of the livelihood related project we have implemented in this landscape after getting Forest Right Act implemented. And thirdly secondly, the weeds to wealth concept. This project is getting implemented even before Forest Right Act coming into picture. Especially this project is implemented in MML's wildlife sanctuary. You all know that lantana is an invasive species, and it's suppressing a native vegetation and toxic to grazing livestock, and it's alters the fire regime and everything. And also the regeneration of the native species and flora and fauna is heavily affected because of the lantana. So the lantana is being monitored by Ankila Iremat and myself, and also earlier we did Dr. K.S. Murali and Arvind et al. And things like that. And a lot of people are involved in this. I'm sorry. The lantana camera used to be like, in 97, it used to be 4%. It has increased to 34% in 2008, and currently it is 47%. You can see the significant increase from past 20 years. At the same time, native flora is declining from 96% to 53%. In that sense, we almost lost 50% of native vegetation in this landscape. And this is the kind of creating a livelihood opportunity out of lantana. This project is getting implemented from past 15 years in MMLs, and we are planning to replicate in other places as well. And these are the products coming out of lantana in MMLs. And this is the Bangalore Airport new terminal. We have the lantana collaborative project, and then the life-size elephants. And this work is being carried out with collaboration of Shola Trust and Elephant Family in UK. And in MMLs, we produce our artisans produce lantana crafts. We have supplied around 80 lantana life-size elephants to the Shola Trust, and they give final touch up and marketing and all those things done by them. In fact, ITRI is not involved in that. So we have 4 craft centers and 24 master craftsmen. We have 400 people have trained, and those 400 people and some of the master craftsmen were able to train 1,000 people outside MMLs. Around 130 households income has increased six times from past 15 years, 2.5 crores. The cash income is being generated from this project, these programs. I don't know how much time I have. This is a journey from past 30 years.
You should be wrapping up as soon as
Okay. In '92, we kind of, Sharad was also involved in this project from the beginning. He was a project coordinator. That's the BCN project, biodiversity conservation project we had. At that time, we were exploring, trying to understand flora and fauna and the demography of the community, and later started the enterprise-based conservation approaches. Now we are following, working on right-based approaches in this landscape and developing community-led co-management plan. And these are the interventions like 77 Gram Sabhas have received community rights, and 2,077 individual rights people have received. And the agriculture, we have been working with 650 farmers, and 500 families benefited from agriculture, agroforestry interventions around, including NTFP processing unit, Lantana processing unit, and including everything. People were able to earn a 3 crore cash income from these projects, and 600 families are got benefited from this project. And thank you very much for the opportunity. I would like to thank all our funding agencies, because we've been working from 30 years. I can't name everybody, the collaborators, staff, and Karnataka Forest Department, as well as for the permission and to encouraging us to do our research in this landscape. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siddhappa. I'm not sure, is there any specific question for him, Simon?
Yes, there's one question. Can you briefly highlight if there are efforts to document this indigenous knowledge in written form?
Yes, that's being done, in fact. Yes. Yeah.
Actually, there's a lot of documentation. I think ITRI also recently produced a book of all the culinary recipes from wild plants. It was a beautiful book where, all the lovely wild plants and the traditional food cooking practices. So there is a lot of information that is being...
Thank you, Renee. And we found, around 134 wild edible plants being used by the communities. That's been documented, and we have recipes and everything. And also all the sacred sites have been documented, and we have plenty of documents available. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Siddhappa. We'll come back to you during the discussion.
Sure. Thank you.
Right. I think we go now to Jennifer. Jennifer, could you start maybe sharing your screen, and I will introduce you briefly. Jennifer, are you there? Right. So Jennifer,
I missed my
okay. So Jennifer, it's a great pleasure to introduce to you Jennifer Tauli Corpus, who is a lawyer from the Kankana Igoro Indigenous people of the Northern Philippines. She's currently the managing director of policy for Nia Tero, a US-based foundation that works with Indigenous people to protect their collective territory and culture worldwide. Jennifer has a lot of experience with working with the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity and the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. So we're really looking forward to listening to Jennifer on this occasion. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm quite happy that I'm going second in this presentation, because a lot of the groundwork was laid by the the first presenter. And I think a lot of the description of the value system and the governance systems of the communities in the first presentation resonate quite strongly with the experience that we've had with the different indigenous communities that we work with. So my field is policy, and so my presentation will have a little bit more of a policy approach, and I will be looking at indigenous and traditional territories and how to recognize indigenous peoples' governance of collective territory as a distinct and effective pathway for conservation, based on Target 3 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And so in 2014, a process was initiated to develop the new Global Biodiversity Framework, which would guide biodiversity action until 2030. And this was happening within a context of a crisis, a biodiversity crisis, also a climate crisis, and many others. However, there was some urgency because the approaches that had been taken in the past did not seem to be working, and it was shown by assessments that were conducted prior to the negotiations on the Global Biodiversity Framework. And we should be quite familiar with this, which is coming from the Global Biodiversity Outlook. Very few greens in terms of tracking the status of implementation of the previous biodiversity strategy, which contained the Aichi biodiversity targets. And so this was the context under which the negotiations were taking place. And of course, this was also quite familiar. This is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which conducted a study that identified the drivers of biodiversity loss. And of course, this was eventually the theory of change that was developed that would guide the development of the framework. So identifying the drivers, the current status, and what the world should be doing in order to address the drivers and the status wherein we are experiencing ecosystem degradation, biodiversity loss. Human well-being was in danger of being jeopardized. There was no or very, very limited sharing of benefits and insufficient resources available in order to carry out the mission of the convention. For indigenous peoples, one of the reflections that we had going into the negotiations was that it was the lack of clear and strong partnerships with indigenous peoples was a major missed opportunity in terms of action in order to fulfill the goals, the targets, and the objectives of the convention itself. And this was confirmed, we think, by the global assessment in its key message B6, wherein it was found that nature managed by indigenous peoples and local communities, although under increasing pressure, and although all over there's a general decline of biological diversity in indigenous peoples' lands, there is a much lower rate, less rapid decline in biodiversity or in nature, but it's nevertheless declining, as is the knowledge of how to manage it. And so we came into the negotiations with this in mind, that in order for the convention to more effectively fulfill its mission, it was important to present ideas on how to have stronger partnerships with indigenous peoples. And the other evidence that we went into the negotiations with is that almost a third of the global land is stewarded by indigenous peoples. And this is a study by Stephen Garnett et al., which shows where indigenous peoples are present in the globe. And also in the different countries, we had maps that were produced showing the overlap between forest areas. And this is my country, the Philippines. And this is a map that was produced by a really strong NGO that works on land rights in the Philippines. So we tracked forest cover. We looked at the key biodiversity areas, the protected areas, as well as the overlap with indigenous territories. And there is quite a significant overlap between the areas rich in biodiversity and the ancestral domains of indigenous peoples. And for us, this says that there is something about the way that indigenous peoples govern their territories that results in good forest cover as well as vibrant biodiversity. And so all of this were the sort of the tools that we brought into the negotiations with us as indigenous peoples through the Indigenous Peoples Major Group, which is known as the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. And after 4 years of hard work, these are the members of the forum. We felt that there was the framework that was finally adopted was quite groundbreaking, because in the past, the Aichi biodiversity targets only had one target explicitly mentioning indigenous peoples. And in the new framework, we had 30% or 7 out of the 23 targets explicitly mentioning indigenous peoples, thereby sending a signal. Actually, there's some language within the framework that explicitly recognizes the roles, the rights, and the contributions of indigenous peoples to biodiversity conservation. Of course, other parts of the framework, even if they don't explicitly mention indigenous peoples, are also relevant. And therefore, there's a need to adjust legal and policy frameworks in order to give effect to the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. It requires full and effective participation in the National Biodiversity Strategy revision process, as well as direct access to finance for indigenous peoples to be able to continue to carry out the governance that has enabled the indigenous territories to be delivering good biodiversity outcomes. Okay, so this is the final text. We were happy that even in the preambular text, the cover decision, there was a specific mention of indigenous peoples, including the need to fully involve indigenous peoples, women and youth, and the need to ensure that rights are respected. Now, going specifically to Target 3, we identify 3 specific clauses within the target that are relevant for indigenous peoples. First is the notion of equitable governance. Second is this recognition of indigenous and traditional territories. And the last one is the requirement to recognize and respect the rights of indigenous peoples. And I'll walk us through that and end with some examples for how we can proceed with the giving effect to these important clauses. Okay, so when we talk about equitable governance, there's a need to recognize that indigenous peoples have their own systems of governance of territory, which has proven effective. And I think this was amply and well presented in the first presentation. And when we talk about recognizing and respecting rights, there has to be a recognition that in the previous way of carrying out conservation, it has resulted in evictions as well as displacement in the governance of territories to detrimental effect to biodiversity. So therefore, in order to prevent such occurrences in the future, there's a need for free, prior, and informed consent, respect for right to lands, territories, and resources. Then related to the first clause that I presented, the self-governance. And then traditional knowledge needs to be recovered as well as supported to be made more vibrant. And there needs to be support as well in order to carry out all of these governance systems. Now, this is what I wanted to focus on specifically, is what it means when we say indigenous and traditional territories in the language of Target 3. Because it's, I think, intentionally vaguely worded, and it could be read as respect for indigenous and traditional territories in the process of establishing protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. But really, the intent of indigenous peoples when we introduced this language, which was, coming late in the process, I think, is that there should be a recognition that there are several pathways by which traditional territories can be included or counted towards the quantitative element of Target 3, the 30% element. And the first pathway would be for indigenous peoples' territories to be recognized as a protected area. And this is done specifically in Canada and in Australia, where you have the IPCAs in Canada and the IPAs in Australia. And then in Brazil, for example, where you have indigenous territories once demarcated and titled automatically being counted towards the commitment, for protection of the terrestrial area of the country. And then we have other effective area-based conservation measures, which are areas that are not that don't have that are governed or managed, but don't have without conservation as the explicit goal of the governance or management, but resulting in effective conservation anyway. And if you look at the way that indigenous peoples govern their territories, they could also fall under OECMs. However, for many indigenous peoples that have undergone the process of of including their territories as an OECM, there's a huge administrative burden, because unlike protected areas, with the OECMs, you have to prove effectiveness year on year. And so there were additional administrative requirements or documentation requirements for indigenous peoples. And, this was a little bit of too much of a burden. And then there is another pathway that we envisioned when we proposed this language on indigenous and traditional territories, which is to recognize with previously proven governance systems of indigenous peoples. And I will provide examples in the next, my apologies, in the next slide. Okay. So, I belong to the Kantanaay Igorot indigenous peoples of community of Busao. And our governance is hybrid in a way. We have a government structure, the barangay. However, it's quite firmly intertwined with community elders. Land ownership system is collective, so everyone owns everything. As my uncle would say, whatever I own, the community owns. Whatever the community owns, I own as a member of the community. We practice shifting agriculture and management of our rice terraces. And we have sacred sites quite firmly recognized. So there are parts of the forest that nobody can enter, especially in certain times of the year. We also have a system of taboos. We have different systems of taboos where there are certain parts of the territory that are carefully managed and cannot be entered during certain times of the year. And it aligns quite closely with the community festivals that that commemorate different parts of the agricultural calendar. So, for example, when it's harvest season, there is a week where nobody is allowed to go to work in the rice terraces or to go to their what do you call this? the place where the shifting agriculture is practiced. There are also the values of Inayan and Ipuyas Nangawis within the community, which are quite vibrant. Inayan means not to waste anything, and Ipuyas Nangawis means to share the good. Or conversely, it also means not to monopolize, all of the good things. So the community festivals are designed so that those who have more are able to distribute what they have to the rest of the community. And so all of those people who are violating these values are looked upon, are frowned upon by the community. As part of government process, we are also required to develop our own, to document an ancestral domain sustainable development and protection plan. And in this plan, there is a chapter on environment considerations where we identify where the sacred sites are located, the governance systems, as well as the systems of taboos that exist within the community. The next slide that I wanted to show is also from a neighboring community wherein they have developed a visual representation of the way that they govern and the way that they conceptualize their community. And so if in the previous slide, there are certain taboo areas and certain sacred sites that are identified as the core of the community and essentially analogous to the conservation areas, in this neighboring community, they say that the entire territory is actually a conserved area because you wouldn't be able to have the residential settlements, or you wouldn't be able to maintain the saguday or the place, the woodlots, without, the community very firmly and clearly delineating the place where the residential lots are located. Okay, so the conclusion, and I will end here because I know my time is running out. Is that there are already existing ways of governance system, ways that Indigenous peoples conceptualize their territory and govern their territory, and that there may not be a need to further impose a different structure on, that subsumes or that overtakes this governance system. So the proposal is that why don't we recognize these governance systems and find a way for these ways of governing territory to be counted towards the commitment under Target 3 without supplanting the governance systems, without supplanting or replacing the governance plans, because these are already proven practices. Now, this addresses that first theory that we had going into the negotiations, that it was really a missed opportunity when governments did not partner effectively with Indigenous peoples. And therefore, looking at the current state where Indigenous peoples' guardianship of territory remained under dire threat, and desiring a future state where the guardianship of territory and the biodiversity and climate benefits that they deliver are valued, defended, scaled, and well-resourced on their own terms, there seems to be a need to build and nurture high-trust partnerships with Indigenous peoples. And our proposal is that this could happen by recognizing that there were those, what I presented earlier, there should be many different pathways for recognizing Indigenous and traditional territories. And perhaps the best way would be to just to recognize that Indigenous peoples have been doing a good job and develop policies to recognize this governance system and this the sustainable development plans, the life plans, and so forth, as something that contributes towards fulfilling the commitment under Target 3. And I will end here. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I just find out from Simon if there are any questions particularly addressed.
There are two questions in the Q&A now. I think one of them would be a nice one for a final discussion round, but there's one, and I think this was typed into the Q&A function before you were showing this really nice example of the Philippines and the forests and how biodiversity actually correlates well with, or huge biodiversity correlates well with the settlements of indigenous people. So Christian was asking, are there examples of different developments of landscapes governed by indigenous people versus not? What are exactly these differences?
And I can talk most competently from my my experience in the area where I live. Very, very early on in the process of establishing protected areas within the Philippines, there was this mountain that was officially declared by the government as a reserve, and it used to be governed by indigenous peoples through their own governance systems. But when the government took over the place and imposed, just this management board to oversee the area, it began to be regarded as government property rather than something owned by the community. And so it shifted completely the way that this area was regarded. And people started coming in and building their gardens there because it was no longer governed by the customary laws of the community and their governance systems. And so what you see is that it's completely degraded, although it's a protected area in name. It's a national park in name. Really, it's now a lot of vegetable gardens, whereas you see the places where the indigenous peoples are still governing the area, they remain richly forested and with high biodiversity. And you can see that also in a lot of maps that in the Amazon, where you can see one part governed by indigenous peoples and it's filled with trees and plants and animals, and then right across a certain boundary you see it degraded and being used as cattle ranches. So there are many, many examples.
Okay, maybe we can add the second question because it's actually it goes well with your first answer, I think. What type of bottlenecks are you dealing with while working out pathways to include the indigenous and traditional territories, especially in regions with natural resources of high economical or commercial value?
Well, yeah, well, of course, a huge bottleneck is, of course, still the discrimination that indigenous peoples face, and all these questions around, oh, our population is so big, and people are, most people are only able to own a small area of land, and how come indigenous peoples have these huge areas of land? And so that narrative is not helpful at all. And then, of course, you have also the bottleneck of values, just which values are I don't know, valued by society. And so when you have that type of discrimination and that kind of misvaluation, I don't know how to call it, of things, then they result in enormous difficulties for indigenous peoples to be able to continue to assert that this amount of area needs to be protected for indigenous peoples and so forth. And then, of course, you have the policy bottleneck. There really are, in most cases, especially in Asia and Africa, there really are no policies by the government for recognition of the contribution of indigenous peoples to biodiversity conservation, which is why we are very hopeful about the the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, because we feel that it lays the foundation for the development of policies that could better protect the governance that Indigenous peoples carry out over their territories.
Okay, thank you. We'll take up other issues, after the next presentation. So, Suneetha, would you introduce our final speaker, please?
Sure. Very happy to, Renee. And yes, again, it gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce Dr. Sharat Chandra Lele. Yeah, I've worked with him in the past, and I think one expression I would say is like he's one of those transformed nerds. He started off as an engineer and then moved over towards environmental studies and looking at environment and society interactions, and has been doing tremendously great work in this area for decades now, especially in the areas of forestry, water and energy sectors, looking at issues of sustainability, equity, and development. Both at the national level in India, but also looking researching and providing inputs to discussions at international forums. With that, the floor is yours, Sharat, to share your experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Suneetha, and it's a pleasure to be part of this symposium and a privilege to be associated with a panel of speakers, be preceded by Siddhappa and Jennifer. And I think in many ways, Jennifer's last comments lay the foundation very nicely for what I'm going to talk about in my talk. So I'm going to switch to screen share so that we can get going on this. Just let me know if you're able to see the screen. Is it visible now?
Yes, it is. Go ahead.
Great. Yeah. So let me begin by saying that unlike Jennifer, I don't qualify as a person of Indigenous people origin in that sense. But at the same time, this is also a very contested term when it comes to India. And there are good reasons for that. The term Indigenous people makes the sort of simplest sense when it comes to the Americas, where there's a very clear-cut sort of date, 1492, when the first contact with European settlers happened. And you have had maybe a 10,000-year history before that of basically the land being peopled by a different set of communities and being left alone to do what they were doing. So the same thing applies, for example, in Australia, where I think it is 1606 is the date on which the first settlers land on the Australian island. And then you have the contact, and then of course you've got colonization of the entire Australian region. So you've got these very sharp delay markers of when you've got local communities inhabiting an area for 5,000, 10,000 years continuously, and then suddenly contact with European settler colonizers. In that context, Indigenous peoples is very simple to define. Native Americans in the US, Aborigines in Australia, and so on. In the Indian context, it's a more complicated picture because we are an old civilization. We are part of the old world where waves of immigration have happened across from different regions of the world, not just from Europe, but also from Southeast Asia, from Tibet, from Mongolia, all kinds of regions into this subcontinent over centuries, over millennia, actually. And so there are no clear markers of contact with the West or contact with European settlers and stuff like that. There are waves and waves of people coming in, settling down, moving in, mingling, and so on. And therefore, who is Indigenous? I mean, I would say, even though I'm not in the technical category of scheduled tribes, I'm sure if there were some genetic tests available, my bloodline would go back at least 5,000 years in this subcontinent. So does that make me an Indigenous people person in that sense? So the Indian government rejects the idea of Indigenous peoples and takes the position that we have something called scheduled tribes that have constitutional protections and are considered distinct, socially marginalized groups, but also culturally distinct groups within the nation. And as per their definition, there are 730 scheduled tribes, which amount to 9% of the Indian population, which, although the percentage number looks small, it's about a third of the US population in that sense, 110 million people, right? So it's a very large population. And therefore, the question of these communities within this country, their fate, their situation is absolutely critical. Over the last several decades, you will see that these communities themselves have adopted the term Adivasi to self-identify. And the term Adivasi actually translates very easily to indigenous or original people, the original inhabitants of the land. So their contention, which is now supported very well with paleo biological records and archaeological records, that there was an initial wave of movement from the African, sort of the origin of human beings, into the Indian subcontinent, 40 to 60,000 years ago. And that's when many of these communities actually settled this land and moved on through Southeast Asia to Australia. And then you've got a big gap before next set of communities moved in from Europe and other parts of the world, the Middle East, say 10,000 or 5,000 years ago. So there is a big gap between these original settlers or original inhabitants and the next wave of immigrants to this region. So in that sense, it still makes sense to call them Adivasis. But the reason they are saying this is to point out also their social marginalization. That in spite of the fact that they are the original inhabitants of this land, they are perhaps the most socially marginalized. And so Adivasi as one group, although it's a very, very diverse group in terms of language, custom, tradition, and so on, and regional distribution, they want to identify themselves as these original inhabitants who have been socially marginalized by subsequent communities that have come and dominated agriculture and other sort of the whole economy of the country, and therefore left them in the lurch in that sense. And if you look at the distribution of scheduled tribes, if you want to call it, or scheduled areas in India, you will see that it's largely in central India, and then a subset in, or a smaller number in, the northeast of India. And although the green in the northeast is small, the rest of the northeast is covered under other constitutional protections because it is also inhabited by Adivasis. This is not to say that the rest of India does not have any Adivasi populations, but they are in very small pockets, and therefore no sub-district is elevated to a protected kind of status anywhere else in the country. What is more interesting is that the presence of Adivasis in India largely correlates with the presence of forest cover, especially as you can see in the central India and northeastern India. And it also largely correlates with the presence of mineral deposits. And this has led to also a very strong correlation, especially in central India, as you can see, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Jharkhand, with the presence of poverty. If this is the poverty map of India, and the highest prevalence of poverty is also in these states with the highest Adivasi populations and forest cover. Apart from, the Northeast is a bit of an outlier. It has high forest cover, high Adivasi presence, a mixed record in terms of poverty and marginalization. It's not as bad as, let's say, Central India. So that's why I'm going to be focusing on Central India, because this is really the place where the question of the Adivasis and the forests, their relationships, and what we do going forward is absolutely crucial, both for the Adivasis and for the forests. Because this equation is so strong, we need to understand why we have this equation in Central India. Why is the Adivasi so marginalized in the presence of rich forests and mineral-rich, deposits? And you can trace that to, of course, the colonial forest policy, which goes back 150 years or more. And if you were to read, for example, the forest manual of the central provinces, it will say, for instance, that, let me just get rid of this. It is of great importance to secure a permanent supply of labor in the forest reserve. So it was a combined policy of taking over forests, excluding people, preventing them from accessing the forests, but then creating pockets of settlements which would be administered by the forest department itself, because they wanted guaranteed labor to actually extract timber from these forests for colonial purposes. So you've got this dual whammy where the Adivasis are prevented from doing shifting cultivation, prevented from their traditional access to forests, but then forced to live in villages and forced to provide labor to the forest department for forestry operations. And you can see here these photographs from colonial period books showing the use of baiga labor, for example, in central India for the harvesting of trees and the transport of logs in these forested regions. And unfortunately, this process of continued extraction of the forest prevails even today in central India, especially. So many other parts of India actually have imposed green felling bans, but not the central Indian states of Maharashtra, Chhattisgarh, and Madhya Pradesh. And you still see the forest being harvested. You still seeing labor being demanded, although not necessarily coerced from these Adivasi communities. And the communities continue to remain impoverished in these forests, along with the impoverishment of the forest itself. So you've got colonial forest policy, which looks at forests as exclusively a source of timber and revenue, which results both in the impoverishment of communities and the impoverishment of the forest itself, because you are transforming the forest, you're making it open for invasive species like lantana. I think Siddhappa mentioned this earlier, to come and completely colonize and take over the forest, reducing biodiversity, reducing the productivity of non-timber forest products, and so on and so forth. So that's really the status of the forest. You've got an impoverished forest, a declining forest, and an impoverished forest-dependent community of the Adivasis, as well as, and it's important to remember that in many parts of central India, along with the Adivasis, you will also find a number of non-Adivasi communities, or those who do not have the same constitutional position, but are, for example, pastoral nomads who are also dependent on forests for grazing, or other communities, mostly again impoverished and marginalized, dependent on these forests. What are the constitutional and legal provisions that we have so far for the Adivasis? So in the Northeast, we have what is called Schedule 6, which gives special sort of autonomy to these regions to manage their own affairs. And some states do not come under Schedule 6 in the Northeast, but they have other constitutional provisions like the state of Nagaland and so on. So they have a very large amount of autonomy, or they had a very large amount of autonomy at the turn of independence in terms of managing their own affairs. Over time, although these constitutional guarantees remain on paper, there has been an undermining of these guarantees in various ways, through funding mechanisms, through states, central policies to encourage rubber plantations, to force the extraction of minerals and the building of dams and so on the local governments. So these provisions have been undermined to some extent. But nevertheless, in terms of use of forests, in terms of continued shifting cultivation, for instance, there is more autonomy in the Northeast for the Adivasis. In the rest of India, we do not have Schedule 6 in operation. We have Schedule 5, which is a weaker protection. It's a more paternalistic protection, which basically says that the governor of the state, who's by and large a figurehead, has some special powers to protect the Adivasis from adverse effects of any state legislation or national legislation. These powers exist on paper, hardly ever exercised. The Schedule 5 status does enable the central and state governments to provide additional funding for quote-unquote tribal development, but this is then unfortunately tied to an idea of development, which is basically that we need to somehow mainstream these Adivasis from their backward quote-unquote ways of behavior and culture to a mainstream form of basically agricultural and then industrial labor. We had in 1996 a special legislation called the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas, or PESA Act, which sought to give special status to the Schedule 5 areas, greater powers, modification or amendments to other laws to bring them in line with the customary laws and customary governance mechanisms of the Adivasis in Schedule 5 areas. The act has not been terribly effective. However, in 2006, we have the passing of the Forest Rights Act. That's the brief name of a much longer name for the act, but it gives rights to communities living in and around forests to both access the forest in a guaranteed manner, in a legislatively protected manner, but also links access rights to management rights. And this is what I think Siddhapa mentioned very briefly, that the community forest resource management rights confer the capacity for these villages to then develop their own management plans for the forest. And as the BRL's example shown by Siddhapa illustrates, this act even applies in protected areas. So their rights will be recognized in spite of whether the area is a wildlife sanctuary, a national park, a tiger reserve, or what have you. The other power of this Forest Rights Act is it's also mandatory to recognize these rights before the diversion of forests for mining, dam, highways, etc. So in a sense, it not only gives them use rights and management rights for forest as they are, but also protects the forests from diversion towards development, and in a sense, diversion, if you want to call it, towards extreme conservation, where then they would be excluded from the forest and possibly evicted from the forest. Their rights would be recognized even in protected areas. So it's an extremely important and landmark piece of legislation which recognizes that there was historic injustice committed towards forest dwelling communities, including Adivasis, and those injustices need to be corrected in this fashion. If you look at the potential of this act, if you just look at central India, we've done a mapping of the areas that could be covered by community forest rights. And it shows that, in fact, 90% of the forest in the central Indian states, of these 4 central Indian states, could actually come under community forest rights if the recognition of rights was properly carried out. In the 15 years since the passing of the act, how much have we progressed in that direction? Well, Maharashtra has made the greatest progress. About 5,000 plus villages have been given rights, and about 1,000 of these villages are exercising them. Odisha has given 4,000 rights. Only a few of them have begun exercising these rights. Chhattisgarh has reached about 4,000. The process of exercising their rights has just begun maybe last year to a small extent. Or the other states which are equally important, like Madhya Pradesh, perhaps the biggest Adivasi population and the biggest forest cover, completely silent on community forest rights, no progress whatsoever, and similar lack of progress in many other central Indian states. Just very briefly, the work that we have done over the last several years has been at multiple levels. It's been in terms of research, looking at bottlenecks to implementation, as well as the impacts of people's rights being recognized. It's been then converted into policy advocacy, trying to help governments, sort of open up these bottlenecks and improve implementation, as well as facilitate management after rights are recognized. Doing a lot of training of communities on the ground, or civil society organizations that work with these communities in terms of how they can get their rights recognized and how they can start managing their forests for livelihood enhancement and forest conservation. And we have also engaged in action on the ground itself to learn ourselves how these rights can be recognized, what are the issues, what are the challenges, and how rights can be actually converted into sustainable and equitable developmental models. So just an example that this research, action, policy, and training are all interconnected. A study of rights recognition in one state of Chhattisgarh then led to us creating a WebGIS platform where we could see for the first time the distribution of revenue boundaries and forest department boundaries on the landscape in a way that was not visible to even forest officials earlier. And this led to then doing a series of training programs for villagers as well as forest officials in the district of Bastar that enabled them to better claim their rights more accurately, more competently, and therefore get those rights recognized and titles to their community forest distributed to the villagers. So this has been one example of how we have tried to link the research to developing tools, to training, and then to action on the ground. It's important to point out that Adivasi communities in central India, when they learn of the provisions of the Forest Rights Act, and this is really important for us to understand, that the key provision of this FRA, which is the community's right to manage the forest, not just access but also manage the forest, has been hidden from the communities of central India, Adivasi as well as non-Adivasi, for the last 15 years. If you go to a random village, people will not be aware of these rights because they have not been told. And the reason they have not been told is because the forest department is vehemently opposed to losing its power over its large forest estate that it has exercised for the last 150 years. When they come to know about these rights, they are extremely interested in claiming those rights. You will see people walking 20 kilometers to demarcate their customary boundary, and even crossing rivers with a GPS tied to a rope in order to actually make sure that the map comes out correctly and not want to wait till the end of the monsoon to do this work. That just shows the level of enthusiasm that people have once they understand that their customary boundaries will be re-recognized by the state, and the forests within those customary boundaries will become their forest to manage. And there is enough evidence that if people start managing their own forests and have the right to sell non-timber forest products, there is ample potential for enhancing incomes. This is a graph from research by my PhD student Anuja Date, where it shows that in the two columns on the right, or two bars on the right, are places where villages have formed federations and are selling tendu leaves, which is a non-timber forest product, on their own instead of going with the forest department, which is the first bar, and the kind of differences in the prices that slowly accumulate over time. When they figure out how to do the marketing themselves, you can see progressively they have a better price than the price that the forest department offers. And it's not just the price, but also the volume of leaves that they are able to sell. So there's ample evidence from Maharashtra that communities, once they take over their forests with a little bit of handholding, can actually improve their livelihoods and conserve forests at the same time. But there are significant threats to the implementation of this act and to the respect for constitutional and legislative guarantees of the that are officially in the Indian law for Adivasis. The first threat is fairly obvious, and I think all of us are familiar with this idea that developmental pressures, if you want to call it that, economic growth, capitalism, to be more precise, drives development in a certain direction, which is extremely dependent on minerals and fossil fuels, and coal mining, manganese, iron ore, etc., which are correlated with this region of Adivasi presence, are one of the major drivers of devastation of forests and therefore devastation of Adivasi lives, displacement of Adivasi communities. But I'd just like to end with the second threat that is, I think, equally important for us to recognize, since this is a conservation community, and that second threat is what I call toxic masculine conservation. Increasingly, conservationists think not only that there should be some areas that are protected where they can go and see the tiger, but they in fact think that there should be areas, bigger and bigger areas, where even if the tiger doesn't exist today, maybe the tiger roamed there 5,000 years ago, the tiger has a right to exist there today, and then we will create those tiger reserves with no tigers, and then go and plant tigers there or transport them from other tiger reserves. And in fact, if the Indian subcontinent lost its last cheetah, maybe 75 years ago, we have the right to bring cheetahs from Africa and create new reserves to, in a sense, plant cheetahs, regardless of whether the cheetahs live or die. And we will expand the reserves to create more places for cheetahs to be seen by urban middle-class conservationists like myself. We will go with our bazooka-like cameras and have a wonderful experience in the wild with the cheetah, no matter that for a 4,000 square kilometer tiger reserve, you're displacing 130 villages, mostly of Adivasis. So I think that that is something for us to keep in mind. And that this is where I'm going to conclude, that why should we engage with indigenous peoples or Adivasis in India and elsewhere, like Jennifer very eloquently pointed out? Yes, they have strong cultures linked to nature, no doubt. But there is absolutely no reason to romanticize, because I think that would be doing a disservice to them as well as to us. They have governance patterns that are worth learning from. They also have governance patterns that are patriarchal, hierarchical, and so on. So there's no particular reason to romanticize either their link with nature or governance, although we should respect and document and propagate those examples that are positive. But it's equally important, therefore, not to treat them as instruments of conservation. That the reason we are engaging with indigenous peoples is because they are naturally conservationists, and therefore they will do a better job of conservation. And that's why we are engaging with them, because then that is an instrumental approach to engagement with Adivasis. I would say that they have the rights to be the primary decision makers in their environment, just like everybody else has rights to be the primary decision makers in their own environment. The problem is that me being a primary decision maker in my urban environment of Bangalore it's going to be important and useful in other contexts, but it's not going to restore the biodiversity of Bangalore, because that was lost 500 years ago or something, when this was an agrarian area itself. So having destroyed biodiversity in my backyard, I really do not have the right to dictate to Adivasis of central India as to how much biodiversity conservation they should be doing. And I think that's the position from which we should start saying they have a right to manage their own environments like everyone else. They are certainly the more marginalized amongst communities in India, and therefore deserve more support from a social justice perspective, that their rights were taken away, they were impoverished, they were marginalized, they are even today looked down upon as backward, and therefore they have a right to be treated better. And hence we need to have a normative shift, not just towards democratic and socially just conservation, which would be a first step, but also a globally sustainable and equitable notion of well-being that we should all aspire to, which in the case of people like me living in the global north effectively means that we need to change our lifestyles to make them much more sustainable, rather than asking the Adivasis to just do the service to global society of being sustainable and conservation oriented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharath. Suneetha, do you want to check whether there are questions directly for Sharath?
I don't see any here.
Simon, are there any questions that have been targeted directly for Sharath?
There's one question, but I think that has been answered during the talk. I can see that. I think the second one, correct me if I'm wrong. The last one, maybe, do you see a way for tiger conservation and Adivasi land rights to be recognized concurrently?
I think the phrasing is probably slightly different in the sense it's not about tiger conservation rights, but yes, I think the question of tiger conservation and Adivasi rights and livelihoods are often cast as being in opposition. But as I said, there are so many things in life that are in opposition. Democracy and development are often in opposition. If you take the example of India versus China, a variety of important social goals are not necessarily all going hand in hand, and there are tensions. Social justice and economic growth are in opposition many times. So I think the point is we have tensions between tiger conservation or wildlife conservation and the exercise of rights by local communities. There will be tensions and there will be sometimes synergy. And the question is, how do we ensure that the process of decision making on these environments is democratic, it respects the rights of local communities, and it is led by local communities, because there is a significant overlap between their livelihood needs and the possibilities of forest conservation, and therefore also tiger conservation. I think BRL is an excellent example of that, where you see during the period that BR got community forest rights, which is 2010 till today, which is the last 15 years, the tiger population in BRLs has probably doubled or tripled, even as the exercise of these rights in terms of extraction of non-timber forest products continues. So these are not necessarily incompatible, but the decision-making rights of people have to be respected, and one has to figure out mechanisms where you can, compensate them with other rights, perhaps, if their rights need to be reduced, and the decision about reducing their rights or limiting their rights has to be also taken jointly.
Thank you so much. Maybe now we've overshot quite a bit, so we have just about half an hour for general discussion. And maybe I'll just get the ball rolling if for all the three speakers who should jump in, maybe if Jennifer, if you could also turn on your video, so that would help, then we can all, I was just wondering, because we've had, I think it's also an issue of scale, and I think Sharath has very correctly pointed out about the definition of indigenous peoples, which will vary dramatically from region to region, particularly places that have had a colonial past or a settler kind of history. So if that is the case, and that the world is divided quite dramatically, in terms of the history of indigenous peoples, and how should what kind of common policies could be thought about, or does it have to be very nation state centric? So you have to take the history of the nation state, its past colonization or settling history, and then we have to build up from that. So does anybody want to comment on this? Jennifer, I'll direct the question to you because, you were hopeful that the Kunming, sort of decision would really help in bringing indigenous peoples to the forefront. So would you want to comment on this, particularly in the light of what Sharath has said?
Yes, yeah, definitely. And coming from one of the regions where definition is difficult, I think, this is something that So Africa is one such country where the notion of indigeneity is quite difficult. However, they do have an African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and what they have done is to provide guidance. They have a publication and guidance documents on who is indigenous within Africa. Within Asia, we don't have something similar because that kind of work has not been initiated yet by any of the regional bodies. So I think it will have to be at the national level. But beyond that, I think one of the good things about the CBD itself is that its Article 8J recognizes indigenous peoples, but also traditional communities. So local communities embodying traditional lifestyles relevant for the sustainable conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, which means that if the community, has traditional structures intact, it almost doesn't require you to define who indigenous peoples are, as long as those traditional hallmarks are in place for a community. So it's quite broad.
Also say that how long do you have to go back in the past to claim tradition? I think we are possibly, maybe Sharath can jump in here, or Suneetha, or whoever. How far back in the past? Because as you know, in India, we've had, as Sharath was saying, waves of these people coming in, and we are currently, trying to go back. How far back do you need to go to say this is mine or this is yours, or how do we do this? Sharath, do you have ideas on this?
I do. I was just going to follow up what Jennifer said, which is that in the global discourse now, we use the term ILC, which is indigenous and local communities. And I think that is a more inclusive term. It helps get past governmental, fidgetiness about particular terms. It helps us overcome that. Even the Forest Rights Act, for example, is about forest dwelling communities. It is not limited to Adivasis. It is all forest dwelling communities, because it recognizes certain ties to the land, and that's the basis on which the rights are being recognized. So I think one needs to be flexible. So one can conceptually think about indigeneity as being important for certain reasons. In the Indian context, it is especially important from the marginalization perspective. And of course, there are cultural traditions that are perhaps makes them, animistic religion, and various other ways in which their ties to nature are clearly stronger than those of other communities, but it is not a uniform picture. So you will not, there are many examples of indigenous communities being willing to also cut down their forests, sell them off, and put their kids into medical college in Bangalore and look for a different pathway for upward mobility. So that we don't have to essentialize and romanticize. And that is my main message, which is that I think we should go beyond ILC, or ILC is a good way to get at the question of social justice as something that we aspire along with conservation, but not a way to romanticize and fossilize them. And therefore, think of it in terms of rights of local communities that exist, no matter whether they are conservationist or not in their orientation. And this sounds very radical, but I think you've got to recognize that democracy means people have rights, period. And if they choose to recognize, use them, quote unquote, wrongly, that just means that we have not brought in the entire set of societal goals into the discussion. We have only talked about democratic rights, but of course, obviously, sustainability, as well as well-being, as well as justice, all these are also part of what we aspire as a society for. The question always has been who imposes those on whom. And I think that's been the challenge all along.
Joseph, you raised your hand. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question to Jennifer, more or less, because you showed this global map of indigenous people of Ghana 2018. And I was wondering whether you agree with this map. And in this context, my question is, what is the tendency? Do these people that are, according to this scheme, assigned to indigenous people, decreasing or increasing in number? And could there be a correlation if you give the indigenous or local communities more rights, say increase in number, and if you give them only poorness, let's say, they will somehow disappear from these local areas and get assimilated somewhere? You understand my question more or less? So, thanks.
Yeah, I do. I understand the question. Yeah, okay. First of all, do I agree with the map? It's very incomplete.
Yeah.
Let me show again if it's okay. Let me. Okay, there are certain areas that don't actually, for example, this entire area here in the South Pacific, it's all indigenous. Yeah. So there are many areas that are not represented, but it's a good starting point.
Okay.
No? So anyway, I'll stop sharing. And regarding the second question is what would happen if the tenure rights of indigenous peoples are recognized? Would these areas with rich biodiversity increase? There are many studies, but unfortunately, most of them concentrated in the Amazon that have shown that, and I wish that these scientific studies could be replicated elsewhere, but they've shown quite clearly that in places where tenure is secure, indigenous peoples are better able to manage and govern their territories, and it results in good biodiversity outcomes. No, and I'm sure that it's the same case in many other many other regions of the world. And I just wish that there were more that were produced outside of the Amazon.
Thank you. Yeah.
Renee, can you unmute? Yes.
Can you still mute?
There's a question. Have you noticed an increase in recognition of indigenous governance styles in environmental policy law training over the past 10 years or so? So the question is from Michael Chase. And I guess it's asking a general question. Are people all over the world, are nation states all over the world, increasingly recognizing the issue of indigenous peoples? Or is it only in some parts of the world? Does anybody want to take that question? Sharath, do you want to take that question?
Sorry, could you just repeat? I had a slightly jittery connection. So could you repeat that?
Okay. Is there an increase over the past 10 years, the last decade, in recognition in nation states all over the world in terms of indigenous, people's governance? So should they get rights? Are there improved rights? So has the last 10 years seen an increase in that kind of awareness?
I think a simple answer would be yes. India is one example where the different laws have been passed in order to increase this kind of recognition. But other states, other countries as well. And I think the simplest examples come from Latin America, where, for example, the Colombian government, passed a new constitution in the 1990s, which for the first time recognized injustice committed post-independence, in the sense because the Colombia got independence from the Spaniards way back in the 1700s. And so they thought of themselves as already decolonized. And it took them 200 years or whatever to recognize that, no, they were still doing a lot of internal colonization. And then the recognition of injustice towards Native Americans and escaped slaves and so on. So you see a lot of that happening now in Latin America, where there are constitutional changes, Supreme Court judgments, which have given stronger rights to communities. You're seeing that in India. You're seeing that in a few other parts. I think Indonesia has started talking a little bit about this, although the implementation might be a bit of a question mark. So yeah, I think overall there is a positive trend. No question about that.
So Renee,
Siddhappa, I have a question for you. Maybe the question is really, can you comment on basic education available to communities, let's say like in BRT? And in BRT, of course, you've said that the communities are well aware of their rights. Are there other organizations like A-Tree which are active in helping communities? I think this is largely related to India. So can you talk about basic education in BRT? And then are there other organizations like A-Tree?
Yeah, thank you, Renee. Firstly, I would like to just echo what Sharad was saying, that the recognition of rights has increased across the globally. Recently, I also had been to Canada, the Vancouver, where the First Nation people rights have been recognized by the government, in fact. And in fact, the communities have taken initiative to control the wild, the huge canopy fires. They are kind of, got around $200,000 to reduce the biomass and they're doing a litter fire and all those things, and showing the government that is possible to control the wildfire, all those things being documented. In fact, this is my recent observation. Just 2 weeks back, I was in Canada. That's what I would like to say. And the second one is, of course, I've been working with the Soliga from 30 years. Initially, we had around 10, 15 graduates. Now we have around 400 graduates, in fact. So that the education and the number of graduates have increased quite significantly among the Soliga community. And also thanks to VGKK Vivekananda Girijara Kalyana Kendra, led by Dr. Sudarshan, and the tribal school is being initiated 40 years back. And they're giving a basic facility up to 10th standard. And also they're helping students to go to their colleges and things like that. I've seen quite a bit of a change related to that. And also other organizations are coming up and trying to help people on that. There are a lot of challenges there. And we have more graduates, but there are a lot, at the same time, we have more dropouts as well, because there was a cultural change that happens in the cities, and they are not able to cope up with the city students, and they're and they'll have financial issues, and they'll try to come back without because they are not able to address those issues. Those are all the challenges that they have. But overall, we have seen quite significant change in terms of number of students increase getting their education. And also some of them have did master degrees, and at least 4 or 5 of them working in my team in BRLs in the enterprise-based conservation model, and 2 of them working with the Forest Right Act implementation related issues, and they have master degree in social science, social welfare, and also masters in economics and things like that. It's not bad, in fact. So that's the way forward. Also, I'm thinking that the people are, instead of thinking about relocating people. And this is the kind of, organic way of, encouraging people to get their education. Hopefully they'll come back as a conservationist to the same landscape. Say, for example, in Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra, other places, we have the tribal, even up to DCFs and the forest officers from the community. And then, those are all the opportunities the community have to explore and the students have to explore. And it'll be really nice. And that's what I was thinking, Renee. Sorry, not able to hear you.
Yeah, to answer the second part, are there other organizations other than A-Tree in India who are involved with can you name of one or two?
So basically locally is VGKK, and there are other institutions helping. Up to 10th standard is not an issue because the government is also encouraging. They have special programs for community, the indigenous communities, and the special food system as well. And the VGKK is one of the organizations helping community to get students to get their younger generation to get their education and things like that. Yeah.
Okay, so we have just about 15 minutes left, but there's one important question that I would like us to debate, and we haven't talked about this. And this is something that has always bothered me. And this is about resources that go across nation boundaries. You can talk about fisheries, you can talk about resources, whether they be minerals or natural resources, and migratory resources, because there are many organisms that do move between nation states. Does anybody have ideas as to how can one nation state, how does one nation state collaborate with another neighboring nation state to ensure protection? And can indigenous peoples, and sometimes indigenous peoples are even shared across nation boundaries. So how does this trans-boundary business, how do we approach it? Sharath, can I ask you to get the ball rolling on this?
I'm not sure I'm particularly qualified to answer this question, but as you said, rightly pointed out, the communities are spread across boundaries. I mean, many of these international nation-state boundaries are artificial. They are the product of colonialism, and communities are divided by these boundaries. And you have the example of the Nagas from Northeast India. There's a Naga community on the Myanmar side and on the Indian side, and they have always fought for a greater Nagaland. So for many of them, that is the vision of they are a one nation. So I think if nation states can reduce tensions across these borders, I mean, right now India has tensions with China, we have tensions with Pakistan, we have tensions with other countries. If we can just reduce these tensions and allow people to move, or people to much more self-govern at a local scale and reach understandings even across borders, I think you would see a better chance of transboundary conservation also being facilitated. This is my, I would say, fairly naive, perhaps, perspective. Maybe Jennifer can add her international experience to this.
Right. Or Suneetha, do you have any thoughts on this trans-nation difficult issue? You've got your hand up also.
Yeah, I do, but I'll just lower it now. No, so I'd like to listen to Jennifer too, because I know she works closely with, for instance, the Sami groups, and they are spread out across different countries, but they managed to do a lot of things together. But it brings us to the point actually that Sharath raised. It's like there is the indigenous governance or the local community governance system, and then of course there are territories. So it's a landscape, and the landscape does not know national boundaries. Yes, we are all aware of that. But it all operates under the nation-state system. So that needs to be extremely supportive. It's easier, I feel, when it comes to sharing biological resources, not humans, but like, fish and rivers and all of this. So sometimes agreements are put in place because it's easier with them. There is no agency that has to be provided, and the politics, it's still very political, but it's compared to people moving across and regulating this is easier because of and so, for instance, the BBNJ, they are called the areas beyond jurisdiction, national jurisdiction. So it's like the high seas and all of this, or any though, because it's beyond a particular country's jurisdiction, and then there are special conventions and treaties in place to try and figure out how to deal with this. And eventually, because a problem comes up, countries come together to negotiate. But with communities, it is a lot of negotiations. There's either somebody's got to make a big noise of it, and in that place, actually, these international forums can play a very, very facilitative role. For instance, the Nagoya Protocol is not just about access and benefit sharing it's like not facilitating access to resources and sharing benefits when we commercialize them. There's a lot more of rights that were secured for Indigenous peoples and local communities through that treaty system. And because it's an international treaty, it can be taken to other forums to secure rights, right? So what's happening, what I see is happening is it's a lot of work that is being put in, especially by Indigenous peoples, Indigenous activists, and people who are invested in these issues. As Sharad said, we are not Indigenous, but then there are people who are interested to advance this the cause of the marginalized, the political marginalization that's happening, and because of that, it enters into the negotiation space. There are countries that are supportive of this, and it comes into decisions. And when it comes into these international decisions, that helps to then come back, because countries then have to implement, even if it says subject to national sovereignty, they've got to put in place policies and regulations that are aligned with what they have committed to in the international sphere. So it's important to also try and get that kind of, a lot of work is being done. And the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework actually is a very good example of how this has been achieved. And with the Kunming-Montreal GBF, an interesting thing is that what didn't exist in the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity before, was a monitoring framework. Okay, so now there is a monitoring framework. Now countries have to report through indicators or whatever, how they are achieving the various targets, which puts them in the spot, right? So they can say we haven't done anything, yes, but they've also opened it up for non-state actors to report, which means Indigenous peoples, anybody can actually report on what's happening on the ground. So that if there is a mismatch, it's there to see. And that, I think, is also they are bits of the puzzle, you could say, like of the solution space that can add to pressurizing countries to take the kind of actions that we wish them to take. But I'd like Jennifer to speak a little bit about the Sami example, or any other that you've seen with the Indigenous people actually collaborating.
Yeah.
For that, I think Siddhappa has his hand up. So can we ask Siddhappa, and then we come back to Jennifer? Yes.
With respect to, thank you, Renee. With respect to the marine ecosystem, especially, that's the boundary is going to be kind of, very important, because one of my students is working in Malwan, and then I was in the field for a week. What we understood was that the boundary is not being honored by the people. What happens is that indigenous boundary is different, and there are other people, external people. They're coming with a high technology and then LED lamps and all those things, try to attract fish and everything that led to the war exploitation, in fact. So in that sense, the boundary would help the indigenous people to use their traditional knowledge, they use their traditional way of fishing, and all those things is going to be important. Likewise, across the nations, if the nation has a high technology, they will be able to exploit more the resource, and then the nation does not have a high technology, and they're kind of so they will get affected a lot. In that sense, the boundary is going to be very important, and then it has to be honored. That's what we have seen. Say, for example, even in the forest landscape also, say, for example, we have the rights being given to the indigenous community. There are, sometimes the traders, they'll try to get people from outside and try to exploit the resource. And the people coming from outside, they will not have ownership on the resource, and they work as a wage laborers. They try to extract as much as possible. That leads to the over exploitation. In that sense, the people and the boundary and their rights with respect to the boundary is going to be very important across the site, state, across the nation. That's what I feel, Professor Renee.
Thank you very much. Jennifer, can we have your thoughts with regard to the Sami, particularly, because that's what Suneetha wanted you to tell us about.
Yeah, this is always the best example that we have on transboundary cooperation, because the Sami are the reindeer herders in the northern Scandinavia, and they've been artificially divided by the borders between Finland, Norway, and Sweden. And what's happened is that the government has supported them to have councils, parliaments in each of the countries, which in a way it also still had some problems because the legal framework in the different countries are quite uneven. They're not all the same. So the Sami in Norway may have more rights than the Sami in Finland, for example. But now there are efforts to just sort of equalize things. And now they have the Sami Parliamentary Council, which brings together all of the different Sami councils. It's a forum where coordination can take place, but also where where it kind of tries to stimulate rise to the top and not sinking to the bottom, just so that everyone goes through this certain standard for rights. And that's the other example is the Inuit, because the Inuit are also spread all over Canada, Greenland, and so forth, Alaska in the US. And so they also have a mechanism for cooperation. And I think that's something that needs to be replicated because, many indigenous peoples are artificially separated by the borders. Yeah.
I think we've just got 2 minutes. Is it, Simon? 2 minutes? I was just going to I know I've opened up, all of you have opened up huge issues, but how is this thing that I have a phone and I can click on Amazon and I can order cloudberries from Sweden, I can order strawberries from God knows, or goji berries from wherever. How does this thing help? Surely this gives us a disconnect with the land, right? We don't care where goji berries grow. We don't care where cloudberries grow. All we want is to gratify, instant gratification. So, of course, this is for a sociological I don't know, perspective. But does anybody, the last 2 minutes, want to tell us about, is this going to really put the nail into the coffin, so to speak? Anybody wants to go? Sharath, go ahead. Goji berries.
So I had a slide. Which I deleted at the end, just before finalizing my presentation. The slide said, "I've discovered the enemy, and the enemy is us." So I think that summarizes my position vis-a-vis your question. I think you're absolutely right that the problem is not out there. It's not with the indigenous people and whether they are retaining their traditions of nature conservation or not, whether they had them in the first place or not, and so on. It is with us because we are the forces of devastation across the whole planet. And by we, I mean people of the global north, and which includes the upper class, the 10%, let's say, of India. And we have to look inwards. And that is why I think conservation is a necessary but not sufficient force for change, because conservation is still in people's mind. It's about saving that last piece of nature out there. And then at some point it becomes saving that last piece of nature out there, no matter what the social cost of that is. If it means kicking out all the people who have lived there for 5,000 years, that's fine. Because the tiger came 1 million years ago or whatever. But not looking inward in terms of where I'm coming from and what lifestyle I live in the city, and then go out and champion conservation. So I think IUBS, all the International Science Council as a whole, which is the umbrella organization for all the scientific unions, have actually converged on this question in terms of saying that although we are in the Anthropocene, this is not a uniformly distributed Anthropocene. There are a lot of people whose footprint is still very small, and there's a minority of people who are consuming majority of the resources, and they are the problem, and that's where the solution has to begin. And I think that recognition has come. There's a lot of shift that has happened in the last 10 years. I feel hopeful about this introspection gathering pace and leading to transformation in the global north.
Okay. Anybody last words before we wrap up?
Just when I was thinking, the ABS system that we have, like, access and benefit sharing, and also, the people who contribute, that value chain analysis, that we speak about is kind of, linked to it. We need to strengthen that. It's not happening. So it cannot happen it has to happen at the national level and the international level as well, where the resource is coming, who is doing what, things like that, it's being harvested sustainably or not. And then you have incentive for them from the end user to the, the big companies and things like that. We need to really think about that. So we should be able to address that issue slowly. I don't know. I'm just thinking about it.
Well, we will end on a hopeful note. How about that? Yes. I do want to thank all the speakers and my co-moderator, Suneetha. And of course, all these webinars will be on the IUBS website. So if you missed anything, you're most welcome to go to the IUBS website and you can, watch them. I think you could download them. I'm not sure, but certainly the links are there and you can watch them. So we've had a very interesting discussion and lovely things to think about, but let's end on an optimistic note. So thank you very much for joining, and I hope that we'll meet again in some other forum. Thank you, Simon, for facilitating. Carl Joseph and Natalie, who's the Executive Director, and IUBS for sponsoring. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.